Okay. And we are on for the next hour or so. So welcome everybody to this evening's presentation. It is a profile of Mojave Desert biogeography. And this is something that I'm particularly interested in. I consider myself a traditional birder in that I like to go out and find birds and identify them. But there are also other ways that I like to get out there and interact with the environment or move through the environment. And I do this through a variety of different ways. It kind of depends on my mood. Sometimes I'll just go out and kind of have a restorative experience, just kind of sit back and just observe nature, not necessarily seek things out. Some more people are coming in. I'm gonna let them in. Sorry about that. Okay, now they're in. And I also really like to go out and put pieces together. I think of myself as a birder, but also an ecologist. I really like how the ecosystem works and to investigate the components that make up an ecosystem. And today we're going to focus on the Mojave ecosystem, but through the lens of understanding what birds are doing throughout the year here in the Mojave Desert and the Las Vegas area. So I have about 45 slides, I think. Some of them will just kind of breeze through. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Or just hold on to them. And we will go over them at the end. We have some time for that. I really encourage that you write things down. In school, we do this quite a bit, but I do want to remind you all, if you're not doing this, that when you're writing things down, you're going to remember way more, or you're going to make connections that you may not otherwise do if you're just absorbing it. So if you're here just for entertainment, that's great too. If you're wanting to learn a lot of stuff, I do encourage finding a pen or a pencil and a notepad and just writing a couple things down. You're going to grab on to different things. It kind of depends on your skill level or when you're tuned in or potentially tuned out. Like I know that with these presentations, it can be hard to pay attention for 1 hour. You're going to drift in and out of that. So you're going to be picking off little pieces here, and some of them might be relevant to you and interesting, and some may not. So we'll talk about some of our big picture items, and this is usually looking at the climate and regional influences. And then we'll kind of zoom in and drill into the habitats and the life zones that make up the Mojave Desert. And then after looking at different habitats within the Mojave Desert, we're going to look at what I call the biological calendar. So this is going to be the roughly the chronology of a year in the Mojave Desert with a focus on Southern Nevada to figure out like what birds are doing, when they're moving through, and why they're doing it, with a special focus on spring migration, because that's the most relevant season to us right now. We're just moving into the height of songbird migration at this latitude and in this hemisphere, of course. We'll talk about some challenges and some small solutions that we can do at home to assist birds in migration and in the Mojave Desert. They're up against a number of different challenges, and there are a couple things that we can do to ensure that they're here for many more millennia. And then, of course, we'll talk about where to view birds along the way. So I almost always start with this map. It's from Jim Boone's birdandhike.com. Most of us have been on there at some point in time, and it's a fantastic resource. And I use this picture all the time. So if you've been on a couple of my presentations already, you're already very familiar with it. But it's also good to have a refresher here and take a look at these 4 deserts that we have in North America. And deserts are considered a biome, and they are regions that receive 10 inches of precipitation, and that can be rainfall or snow or a combination of two. That's at 10 inches or less annually. So it's really defined by the aridity, but also the rate of evaporation. The rate of evaporation is going to be higher than the amount of moisture that can come into the system. So it's always going to be losing more water than it's gaining under most circumstances. That's the average or the mean. And if you look at the Mojave Desert, that's going to be the smallest of the 4 deserts that we have. This desert is going to go kind of up to St. George, Utah. So, this map is great to get an idea. You could probably move the boundaries of some of these deserts a little bit more. Mojave Desert probably goes up into St. George, Utah, and then towards like Joshua Tree to the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. And Las Vegas is kind of like, not quite in the center, but just right of center of the center of the Mojave. Now, we're going to, move away from that very general map, and we're going to look at something that is a lot more specific. And what you're looking at is a map of ecoregions across the entire state. And the different colors correspond to different ecoregions. And ecoregions can be thought of as areas of distinct climate with unique plant and animal life within them. So the Mojave itself is considered an ecoregion. The biome is a desert, but it's a different desert from the Sonora, and it's a different desert from the Chihuahua and the Great Basin. So it's its own ecoregion. And within the ecoregion, and now what we're looking at here is the southern half of this map that I just showed you. I just clipped it off so that we're looking at our area here in Southern Nevada, and you can read a lot more about those ecoregions. And this is a very technical piece of information that you're looking at here. So don't get too bogged down in it. I just want to remind you that the colors mean different things. And if you look at Las Vegas, which is signified by that arrow, you'll see sort of this beige color, and you might see that there's a key called 14A. And if you go and look for 14A at the bottom left of that key, you're going to see that it is called a creosote bush dominated basin. So we're in the Mojave Desert, and where Las Vegas is a creosote bush dominated basin. If you go to the west, you're going to get into a 14B and then a 14C and a 14D as you go up to Mount Charleston. So what that means is you're going into the arid foot slopes. So you're going into sort of like the Joshua Tree woodlands. Then you get into Mojave mountain woodland and shrubland. So you're getting more like pinyon, pine, and juniper. And then eventually you get to the Mojave high elevation mountains. And then if you were to head even farther west towards Pahrump, you'd still be in the Mojave Desert, but you'd be in what's called Amargosa Desert. And that's going to have a lot more saltbush and less of that creosote. So it's still Mojave Desert. It's still a 14. Now, within the context of Clark County, here's something that's pointed by that green arrow that I think is so interesting. You're looking at 22D. And what 22D is it's a part of the middle elevation mountains of the Arizona and New Mexico plateau. So this is an area that is a lot more similar to the Grand Canyon and the Flagstaff area than it is to Mount Charleston or the Sheep Range. This is the Virgin Mountain Range. And if you look at a map of the Virgin Mountains, you'll see that they're very close to the large mid elevations of the Grand Canyon area or the Colorado Plateau. So what that means for plants and animals is that there are a couple things there that we don't get in Mount Charleston, even though they're at similar elevations and they're in the same county, Clark County, Nevada. What they get there include the Douglas fir trees. There's a Douglas fir stand in the Virgin Mountains, 22D in Clark County. And you also get a couple birds that we don't get here, like the hepatic tanager. That's a bird you can get in Flagstaff, no problem. And last summer, there was a pair that was found in the Virgin Mountains, 22D, that we definitely do not get here in the Spring Mountains in the summer. They might get more painted red stars. They might get more Mexican whippoorwills. So it's a little slice of northwestern Arizona in that part of the Virgin Mountains. So not technically Mojave, but since we're in Clark County, I wanted to point that out because I think it's super interesting. So let's continue to drill in a little bit here. What you're looking at here is a cross section of, you can think of this as the Spring Mountains. And what I have here are the main dominant plant zones or life zones found at different elevations in a place like the Spring Mountains or the Sheep Range. And at the very bottom right, you're looking at your streams and wetlands. I doodled all this stuff. You can tell that I'm doing a very basic job here. These are very crude illustrations that I'm using on PowerPoint, but I have a lot of fun making them. That's supposed to be a riparian woodland. So like think about Clark County Wetlands Park, low elevation, Gooding's willows and Fremont's cottonwoods. And then you start to move into the valleys like the creosote valleys. You're going to find those at like 1,400 feet in elevation. And as you get higher and higher, you start to see that the plants change and you have these dominant plants. When you see these dominant plants, you can actually make a pretty good guess as to what elevation you're at, because these grow pretty consistently at certain elevations across the Mojave. So moving upward, you run into your Joshua tree and your blackbrush. Moving higher, you start to phase into the pinyon juniper woodlands, or as a lot of people call them, the PJ. You get higher and you get into the montane, the aspens and the ponderosa pines. And then finally, you get up to the bristlecone pines at like 8,300 feet up to tree line. You can get them lower than 8,300 feet. And at that point, you're amongst some of the oldest living organisms in the world. Some of these bristlecone pines way up there are 4,500 years old. Extremely old trees up there, just up in Mount Charleston in the Sheep Range. So this is a wash heading down to the Colorado River, close to Boulder City. This is very low elevation. And as you get out there and you start paying more attention to the birds and the habitats that they're in, pay really close attention to the plants. I challenge you to go learn the 5 most common plants in all the places that you're birding. And you'll start to notice some themes. When you're at Clark County Wetlands Park and you start to run into the Gooding's willows and the Fremont's cottonwoods and the arrowweeds, you're going to start to connect that certain birds love those types of plants, like yellow warblers and summer tanagers and Bell's vireos. If you're in a place like this, down in the Colorado River, well, you might expect some rock wrens or some canyon wrens, maybe some black-throated sparrows amongst the brittle bush and the creosote, the catclaw acacia, the glow mallow, and this low elevation heading down to the Colorado River. If you're at Corn Creek, like where I took this photo, you're going to start to notice that birds are congregating around the saltbush and the mesquites or the mistletoe. And you start to move higher and higher, and this is taken over at Cow Canyon. And of course, your plant life continues to change. You don't really see any mesquites at that elevation, but you start to see more Joshua trees. Maybe you start to get a couple junipers, and by 6,000 feet in elevation, you have a lot of Utah junipers and a couple pinyon pines. It's time to start looking for a black-chinned sparrow if it's April or May or June, gray vireo. Listen for porwills if you're out there at night. Look for Pinyon Jays and juniper titmice. And of course, by the time you get to 7,000 feet or higher, you're in ponderosa pine dominated plant communities. Maybe there's some limber pine in there. Maybe there's some quaking aspens as well. But you're going to notice a lot of these big towering ponderosa pines. So that's sort of an overview of our plant communities with a lens looking at the elevation, and elevation really drives temperature, and temperature drives the presence or absence of different plants like the ones we were looking at. So those are the main things to always keep in mind. And then of course, the presence of moisture will in the soil will dictate what plants you get. Mesquites can tap into deep groundwater In the valleys where it looks really arid, they're able to do that. But the ponderosa pines, they're relying on melted snow. So right now there's a lot of snow melting up at high elevation, and some of that is seeping down into the soil and nourishing the ponderosa pine. So they're more dependent on snow. So a lot of these plants are getting their water from different sources. Now let's look at a calendar year, or not really calendar year, because no animals are abiding by a calendar year. We have these arbitrary calendars, and it just so happens that like we can fit in general some movements of birds and other animals into those calendars that we create. So here in Southern Nevada, I think of spring as starting in March, and it goes through late May, and then after that it's summer. So we're going to start with spring, and we're going to spend a lot of time on spring and a little less time on the other 3 seasons. So what do we expect in spring in Southern Nevada? Well, our waterfowl and our winter birds, they're going to begin to leave for Canada and Alaska and other parts of the Western United States. So a lot of our waterfowl actually breed in ponds and lakes in Utah and Nevada. So some of them don't really go that far. Some of our year-round birds you can also call residents or residential birds. They begin to breed in February or March, or definitely by April. So in the next few weeks, we'll start to see some young verdins flying around and young northern mockingbirds. These are the birds that don't really migrate, and because they don't have to migrate and come into this region, all they have to do is establish a territory in the areas that they were already spending the wintertime in, and set up shop, begin maintaining territory and building a nest, taking care of young and helping the young fledge. And then we'll start to see more birds come in from other areas like Mexico and Central America. If we were on the East Coast and we were, tuning in from like New Jersey or Florida, I would be telling you that a lot of our songbirds are coming across the Gulf of Mexico, or they're island hopping from the Yucatan to Cuba into Florida and going up the Atlantic. And a lot of those birds would be spending the winters in the tropical forests of the Yucatan and Costa Rica and Panama. A lot of our birds actually spend their winters in the western mountains of pretty arid parts of Mexico. So these birds like arid parts of North America for breeding and arid areas to overwinter in Mexico. So that's a generality. There are going to be exceptions to that, of course, but that is one good way to think about it. These arid birds like to be in arid areas all year round. Not always the case. There are exceptions, of course, but you're more often going to be right rather than wrong if you were to make that guess. Big days are things that people like to do, and people can come up with 150, 160, 170 species in one day in Clark County around like May 10th, May 15th. There are just that many species moving through at that time. So our waterfowl are starting to move out. We have some of our shorebirds starting to come in, going from the American avocet all the way at the top left, all the way around clockwise. We have a long-billed dowitcher. We have a killdeer, least sandpiper. These are shorebirds, and shorebirds are birds that are part of a couple different families of birds that are fairly related. And the best thing to do to break down your shorebirds is look at bill length or bill shape and then leg length, because different shorebirds are going after very specific things to eat. And they're doing these different ways, and that's how you're able to get so many different species without them competing amongst one another. They're able to occupy different niche spaces. So something like that long-billed dowitcher at the top right with that really long bill, it can probe deep into the mud. That American avocet at the top left, it can sweep along the surface of the water and pick off gnats. And the least sandpipers, they're going to probe into the mud along the shoreline, while the killdeer is going to run kind of like a robin along open surfaces and pick off things. It's using its eyesight a lot more than, say, the dowitcher would. So these shorebirds are starting to come through. Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve and parts of the Las Vegas Wash are great places to see these birds right now, and they'll be moving through in high numbers and high diversity for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then we are looking at some birds here that people get super excited about. These are some of our really diverse and small, exciting songbirds. It's a really large family of songbirds that we're going to talk about right now. These are our wood warblers in the family Parulidae. There are about 50 species that breed in North America, and we can get in the ballpark of about 15 regularly occurring wood warblers moving through southern Nevada in April. And something that's really exciting for a lot of some of our birders is going out and finding the ones that have gone off course, these eastern warblers that can show up here in southern Nevada. Places like Corn Creek and Floyd Lamb are two of the best places to look for wayward eastern warblers and other songbirds, especially in May and June. So while on the topic of migratory songbirds, how do they do it? Well, around December 21st, we have our winter solstice. So in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, you're getting equal amounts of daylight. And then every day after that, the northern hemisphere coming up to now is increasing the amount of daylight. That means that there's more solar radiation hitting the northern hemisphere, and that means it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. So that's going to signal to plants to begin photosynthesizing and putting out new growth, new leaves, new flowers. When the new flowers come out and the leaves come out, now the insects come out of dormancy and they start to get active. They're going to go through their breeding cycles, and it's going to start enticing birds to want to move farther north. And for those birds that are in Mexico or Central America or South America, they're going to see the amount of daylight, and it's going to trigger a cascade of hormonal changes that changes their behavior. So they're going to start to get kind of antsy, and they're going to start to feed and feed and feed, fatten up, and they're going to start to make their northward migrations back into North America. Over in Africa, you're going to have birds that are going to going back into Europe, and over in Asia, you're going to get birds that are going back into northern China or Russia. So it's happening all across the northern hemisphere at approximately the same time if you're looking at latitude. And so it's that amount of daylight and temperature that are the environmental cues that are primarily responsible for bringing this spring activity from insects and birds and reptiles, mammals. I mean, everything is responding to this increase in temperature and this increase in daylight. At the same time, you have winds now shifting because you have less and less cold fronts coming from the north, and now you have prevailing southerly winds coming from the south. So southerly winds, it doesn't mean that the winds are heading south, it means they're coming from the south. So those winds are going to start to go north, and that's going to be a nice tailwind for these migratory birds to start to head north. They don't want to fly into a headwind in the springtime because it's going to be harder for them to get to where they want to go. It's going to slow them down, and it's going to waste a lot of very important energy. So they're going to wait until those nice southerly winds start to prevail, and they're going to start to move north. And that's what we're starting to see now. Winds coming out of the south. These birds have a nice tailwind. They're like, all right, cool. I'm not flying against the wind. I'm flying with it, and I'm going to get to where I want to go, and I'm going to get the best territory possible, and I'm going to sing my best song I've been practicing over the wintertime just a little bit. I'm going to attract a genetically fit mate, and we're going to protect our nest and our territory for a couple of weeks. We're going to ensure that our young fledge the nest and that they have the best opportunity possible. That's not what these birds are thinking. At least I don't think they're thinking that, but that's basically what's on their minds in some sort of instinctive manner. And a lot of people like to talk about flyways. There are 4 flyways identified in North America, but I do want to say that flyways are, again, these are generalities. The way that birds move around is a lot more complex than this. And the concept of flyways was actually created by duck hunters and duck conservationists. So they're useful. We can talk about flyways in the context of flyways. It's helpful to talk about, but they're not 100% accurate, especially if you're talking about some of these other birds. And if you're looking at the map on the right now, what I want you to notice is that Nevada is a basin and range state. So we have all these different mountain ranges with big basins in between. And so for a migratory bird, they do not really want to go into the basins where it's hot and exposed with low vegetation, unless it's a place like Corn Creek. That's an exception, right? Like you have some water, a little oasis out in the middle of that basin. For the most part, birds want to stay in the mountains or close to the mountains where there's taller trees. It's cooler, there's more shade, there's more cover, there's more habitat, there's more opportunities to find food, and there are also more opportunities to find water. So a lot of our birds are actually using these mountain ranges a lot more than migrating through our basins. So you're going to see these arrows here. This is a theoretical migratory route for any number of birds, where I'm illustrating that they're going to be moving not completely north. It's a northward trend, and they're just going to be migrating following these mountain ranges that are conveniently oriented north-south here in the state of Nevada. It's pretty cool that we have so many mountain ranges and that many of them are north-south, because conveniently for the birds, they mostly want to be trending north and south as well. So you can head up into the Spring Mountains. You can drive up there pretty easily. You can hike into the Sheep Mountains. It's you need to take your water and a lot more resources with you because there are no roads that go high into the mountains. But you can go up there and you can see lots of birds drinking from some of those streams up there, some of the snow melt up there. So this is a photo I actually took last September, but it does illustrate the point nonetheless. This is a Western tanager drinking water in the Deer Creek area. We don't just have warblers and tanagers coming through, we have black-headed grosbeaks at places like Corn Creek. And if you are in some of our arid areas or some of our canyons, you have a chance of seeing some of our residential birds that we don't get really in the city, but they can be quite common or expected in the right habitats. So you're looking at a canyon wren on the left, you're looking at a rock wren on the right. These two birds are closely related. They probably came from the same common ancestor, but they have partitioned in a really interesting way. And by that, I mean that they are found in the similar habitats, but the rock wren is more on rock piles, like maybe at the bottom of a wash or the bottom of a canyon, while the canyon wren is living on very vertical areas, probably above or below where the rock wrens are hanging out. We have a couple birds with really unique adaptations or relationships with certain species of plants. This is a bird that everyone has gone through the trouble of trying to pronounce the name of for at least a few times. You're looking at a Phainopepla, and that's Phainopepla. Phainopepla, that's 4 syllables. This is a female. The males are structurally identical. They're the same size and shape, but they are a glossier, sort of jet black, maybe with some iridescence. Both the males and the females have that blood red eye. Some people call them goth cardinals. I think that's a really funny name for them, but they're not related to cardinals. And these are silky flycatchers, but they're not related to our typical flycatchers like kingbirds or ash-throated flycatchers or gray flycatchers, phoebes. Those are Tyrannidae flycatchers. The silky flycatchers are fruit-eating birds that are mostly found in Central and South America. We have one silky flycatcher living in North America, and it's this one. It's the Phainopepla. And they like to eat the fruit of the desert mistletoe. What you're looking at there is a big heap of the fruit of the desert mistletoe. And the desert mistletoe is a plant that grows almost exclusively on honey mesquite and catclaw acacia across the Mojave Desert. So this is a really interesting relationship. We have a bird that eats mostly the fruit of a plant that grows almost exclusively on two different types of other plants that you usually find in lower elevations across the Mojave. Now, Phainopeplas can be found in California, breeding in different types of habitats or down in other deserts, and they're kind of moving around chasing food sources because fruit from different species of plants are going to come out at different times of the year. So the Phainopepla follows the food around, but in the Mojave Desert, they're really going after that. So like I said, a lot of focus on spring. We're going to talk about summer, fall, and wintertime. And this is a pretty slow time for us, starting in late May, going through August. Summer is staggered elevationally. What I mean by that is that down here, it's going to start to really warm up, and we have a lot of birds already breeding down here. But up in the spring mountains, it's a lot cooler still. There's still snow up there. And so birds haven't really started to breed. They've started to sing. So like generally bird activity or breeding activity is going to be a lot slower to start high up because there's less food around. The plants haven't really started to produce much yet. So different things are going on at those higher elevations. That's what I mean by it's staggered. In the lowlands, we might have birds that breed several times because they can. My advice to birders is to get to really know the young birds and the residential birds in your neighborhoods, because, you know, what else are you going to look at? If you're staying in Las Vegas, really get to know those birds, like your northern mockingbirds, your lesser goldfinches. And what you see here is a lesser goldfinch coming to a man-made water source out in the Searchlight area. Somebody put out a pond and planted some native sunflowers, and goldfinches and other finches just go berserk over sunflowers. And so what you're looking at here is a female lesser goldfinch going after some of those sunflowers. You can always go up into the mountains, and even in July, you can get some bird activity up there. It's still pretty hot, but it's generally 20, even 30 degrees cooler up there than it is down here in the Las Vegas Valley. So if it's like 110 here, it might be 80 or 90 if you go to Fletcher Canyon or Deer Creek. And I'm going to focus on this bird on the left real quick because it's really interesting. This is a Clark's nutcracker. The Clark's nutcracker is in the family Corvidae. So that includes the ravens, the crows, the magpies, the jays. The Clark's nutcracker is a montane bird, or it's a mountainous bird, and you find them almost exclusively in areas where you have coniferous trees or cone-bearing trees being the most dominant plants. And the Clark's nutcracker are going after white bark pine in some areas. We don't have any white bark pine in the Spring Mountains, but we have them elsewhere in the state. They're going after limber pine, and they're going after bristlecone pine cones. They do some really interesting things here. These birds are called scatter hoarders. So what this means is one of their foraging strategies is to go to different pine trees that are producing cones. Within those cones, there are seeds that these birds want to eat. Now they will go to these cones and they will crack open parts of the cone and they will remove the seeds. Some of them they'll eat on the spot because they need the calories right then and there. But they're also doing a lot of preparation for the cooler months to come. So what they're going to do is they're going to start to scatter many different seeds over an area that they anticipate spending the wintertime in. So their territory, their range. And as they're doing that, they're going to be putting some of these seeds in areas where they're going to forget where the seeds are. They will remember where the majority of them are because they have insanely great spatial memories, and they can go back and they can find most of the food that they are hiding. But this is a way for a lot of these pine trees to be able to disperse their offspring into different areas across the region, even because these birds will hop between different mountain ranges on occasion. So the Clark's nutcracker depends on these pine trees to produce cones, and these pine trees heavily depend on the Clark's nutcracker to disperse their offspring for them to keep the whole cycle going. So Clark's nutcracker, incredibly important bird. It's a scatter hoarder. And then this bird on the right, the pygmy nuthatch, this is a bird that will be looking for some of the seeds that the Clark's nutcracker has hidden. They can find food on their own too, but these industrious little birds will be looking around in the bark, looking for the caches of woodpeckers and jays and Clark's nutcrackers to find any food that that they stored somewhere. So there's so much going on up there, even in the summertime. This is happening year round, but I'm focusing on these birds right now because I want you to get up there this summer and check out some of these really cool montane birds. All right, so we got through some of the hardest parts of the year, June, July, early August, and now it's mid-August. Well, believe it or not, a lot of our shorebirds are starting to move back into our area. They're coming back from Alaska and Canada. They're coming back from the tundra, the Arctic, even the taiga forest, the boreal forests with spruce bogs, and they're starting to migrate down. They raise their young really fast, and this is partially because all the way up in the northern latitudes, like up in the Arctic Circle or in Canada, there can be 20 to 24 hours of daylight for some of the summer. So what that means is these birds can be feeding their young constantly, and those young grow up really fast, and then they can get out before that early winter arrives. It can start to snow in the Arctic in August. That's not good news for these birds. They need to get out quickly. So they start to come back through here, which is pretty fascinating. When we start to get our cold fronts, our insectivores start to move out, our insectivores being our insect eaters. We'll start to see them move through in September, and then by October, you start to see some of our hardier winter species move through, and the bird-eating raptors will be coming down with them. So sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks, their peak migration is at the same exact time as peak songbird migration. There's a good reason for that. They love to eat songbirds, and if the songbirds are going to start to move, they move too. Into October and November, we'll start to get, again, some of those hardier species of birds like our woodpeckers, our bluebirds, our robins, our sparrows, finches, birds that can eat seeds, or they can find available food or switch to fruit, start eating juniper or some of the ornamental plants that we have growing in Las Vegas. And in late August and September, we also have our pinyon pine. They're going to start to put their cones out. And when those new cones come out, the Pinyon Jays start to get to work. And they do basically the same thing as the Clark's nutcrackers do. They get together in these groups and they congregate around massed crops of pinyon pines, and they start to cache these pinyon pine seeds for the wintertime, and they'll be feeding on those caches for most of the year. Here's a really ambitious pinyon pine, pinyon jay flying off with a pinyon pine cone. You can see that cone actually has some green on it. That's how fresh it is. So this photo was taken during a Red Rock Audubon pinyon jay survey, where we used an app that the Great Basin Bird Observatory created for us to use so that we could help with the Pinyon Jay population monitoring efforts. Pinyon Jays they've declined by about 85% in the last 40 or 50 years, and they continue to decline. It went from being one of the most abundant birds in certain habitats in Nevada to something that may be listed as endangered very quickly. As I mentioned, we start to get our raptors. They're moving through chasing their favorite food. So kestrels, they like to eat insects. Well, they're not going to find a lot of insects in Wyoming or Idaho in October, November. So they start to come through too. We'll start to get a northern flickers come in around the 1st of October. And then we get acquainted with these birds again, the white-crowned sparrow. Start saying goodbye to these birds. They're going to start to migrate north really quickly. So you might have them in your yard. You definitely have them at your closest park, and take it in right now. This is one of our staple wintering birds, and they've been practicing their songs all winter long. Perhaps you've heard them. They're going to start taking off pretty soon. Yellow-rumped warblers. This is a bird that right now they're looking so good. These birds are looking so sharp. And when they arrive in October and they stick through into March, they look kind of like this. They're not the most extraordinary warbler to look at, but right now they are just gleaming. The adults, they have these like cobalt gray, almost bluish backs with coarse black streaking on the backs. They've got bold yellow on the throat and on the flanks. And they're just looking really good. They went from being one of our most passable birds because it's yet another yellow-rumped warbler that you've seen on your birding outing. Maybe you've seen 50 or 60 or 70 every single morning that you've gone out since October, and now they're looking good, just in time for them to migrate out, and you can't enjoy them at their best. And if I had the time and the artistic skills, I would create a shirt that has a yellow-rumped warbler in non-breeding plumage and then a yellow-rumped warbler in breeding plumage. And it would say, if you can't enjoy me at my worst, you don't deserve to see me at my best. It's an adaptation from a Marilyn Monroe quote. But I think it's so true about yellow-rumped warblers. They're just like the best, one of the most sharp looking birds right now, and they're everywhere. So go out and check those yellow-rumped warblers out. November through early March, this is functionally winter for us. We start to get a lot of our ducks are starting to come back. The most adaptable insectivores are finding insects, sometimes low to the ground. That's where the bugs are. Maybe they're eating a little bit of fruit. Our waterfowl start to come through and congregate at places like Henderson Bird Viewing Preserve, the Wetlands Park, the Wash, Sunset Park, Cornerstone. Many of our sparrows are hanging out. They can eat seeds all wintertime. They don't have to worry about losing their main food sources like the insects because they're eating mostly seeds. And our wetlands are really vibrant with bird life. Like if you go to the Wash in December or January, and if you're experienced enough and you know what you're listening for and you spend enough time out there, you can come up with 60 or 70 species of birds in the wintertime at a place like the Las Vegas Wash. So our waterfowl, they're starting to really come through. That includes our geese. Our geese are more of grazers. So you can find them at some of our ballparks or parks with a lot of lawn because they like to eat a lot of grass. They graze a little bit more than waterfowl do, or excuse me, ducks do. They're all waterfowl, but ducks like to feed in the water a lot more. Geese are grazers. If you went to a place like Lake Mead, like Boulder Beach, well, you'd find lots of diving ducks, and you have the chance of finding something really interesting, like a scoter. What you're looking at here are two species of scoters, and scoters are diving ducks or sea ducks. You might think to yourself, wait a second, we don't have a sea here in the Mojave Desert. Well, we have Lake Mead, and we also have their favorite foods, which are bivalves or clams, mussels, hard-shelled organisms. And we have an introduced population of mussels, quagga mussels. And because we have introduced mussels to the lake, and these ducks like to eat mussels, we now get a couple scoters usually spending time in Lake Mead. We also get bald eagles in Lake Mead. I know that a couple dozen were found during raptor surveys conducted in January. along the Colorado River, close to Lake Mead and Lake Mead itself. We get our state bird, the mountain bluebird. They start to come through, and you can find them at low to mid elevations, especially around Mojave yuccas and Joshua Tree Forest, kind of like the 2,500 to 4,500 elevation range. And it's really quiet up there on Mount Charleston and the Spring Mountains, but there are birds that don't migrate, like the mountain chickadee. The mountain chickadee probably weighs the same amount as a nickel, maybe even less than a nickel, but it survives up in places like Mount Charleston at elevations of like 8,000 or 9,000 feet because it has some really amazing adaptations to help them do that. So like the corvids, they have insanely capable or insanely robust spatial memory formations. And so what happens in their brains is they actually adapt to the wintertime. The brains do. They modify a little bit. So there are parts of the brain that we have too. It's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a part of the brain that takes in new information, then consolidates it. So if any of this information is new to you tonight, it's going to sit in your hippocampus. It's kind of like the inbox of the brain. And then when you go to sleep, signals from the hippocampus are going to move those new memories into probably the prefrontal cortex or other parts of the brain, and then it gets embedded, and you have that that kind of forever. Well, same thing's happening with these birds, but at a very quick pace, because they have to learn very quickly where they're storing food. So they're storing a lot of food and they're remembering where it is. They're caching food. They're scatter hoarders like the Pinyon Jay and the Clark's nutcracker. They're also able to drop their body temperature by about 20 degrees. Maybe it's a little bit more than 20 degrees from like, I think about 100 degrees down into the low 80s. And that's going to help them survive the night, slowing down their metabolism. And then in the morning they wake up and their core body temperature really just like shoots up. They start to get really active, and then at night they wind down again, which is really fascinating that these birds are able to do that. That's your mountain chickadee. And you know, we've seen this slide already. These are our waterfowl moving again, and winter is kind of over and we're moving back into our next spring. So that's your biological calendar. So what can we do as people that are interested in birds and bird conservation and habitat conservation in the Mojave Desert? Because of course, if we take care of birds, we're taking care of the entire ecosystem. We're taking care of the reptiles, the mammals, the insects, the pollinating plants, the dicots, the monocots, the fungi, the cryptobiotic soil. If it matters to you, you can take action through taking action for birds. So some big things: advocate for our streams and wetlands. Where there's water in the desert, there is life. We can help our partners like Endow and Friends of Nevada Wilderness with their guzzler programs. These are creating little areas of the desert where there is consistent water sources. And so Nevada Department of Wildlife does that. Friends of Nevada Wilderness, they have some programs. Plant more native and drought tolerant species of shrubs and trees. These are going to be plants that are familiar to birds, and because they're familiar and they have co-evolved together, they're going to be seeking these plants out. And so some of these plants are a little bit difficult to find sometimes, but you can find them if you're diligent at places like Star Nursery or Cactus Joe's or some of our smaller independent nurseries too. Identify important areas and corridors and advocate for them. Bring them to our attention. If you see a really important bird area, let us know. Keep cats indoors. You know, I think we all know at this point that cats in the United States are killing anywhere between 2 and 4 billion with a B birds per year. And if this is a tough compromise, then at least try to keep those cats in early in the morning, towards the end of the day, and especially during breeding season, which is right now, because fledglings are really incapable of getting away from cats. Break up those reflective qualities in your windows. Window collisions account for probably the second most bird deaths per year across the globe, and help Red Rock Audubon Society and the Great Basin Bird Observatory to conduct surveys, help us volunteer, getting out there. So much of this is spreading awareness. People love birds, and people want to help birds. They just don't know what birds are going through. They don't know how good bird watching can be for their livelihood or their wellness, their well-being, their mental health. And by getting out there and sharing why birds are important for a functioning ecosystem and why birding, the act of seeking out birds, can benefit you, maybe we can recruit more people that can help to curb this decline in bird populations across the country, across the world, and across the Mojave Desert. So if you want to send me an email, my Red Rock Audubon email is there. My number's there. If there's, I don't know, please don't prank me or anything like that. I trust you all to use that wisely. Don't sell my information to anyone. Yeah, keep in touch. I try my best to point people in the right direction if they have the interest. So I'm gonna go ahead and escape there and stop sharing the screen. We'll go to the chat. We'll answer some questions, and then I'll let you all go for the rest of the evening. Stop sharing. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to go into the chat. Ashley has some free daily cat facts. Oh, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that we should share facts, or do you have facts for us? Because I'm open to any of those things.
I think I took it as the fact that the cat fact that you shared as free daily cat fact.
Yeah. She's saying that she's going to spam my phone with cat facts. That's actually fine. And actually, I prefer YouTube videos if you can. That's fine, Ashley.
I'll buy your yellow rump warbler t-shirt idea, Alex.
You know what I mean, right? Like,
yes,
kind of breeze past those yellow rump warblers, and then right now you're like, I can't look away from them.
Today in my backyard specifically, it stopped me in my tracks because I had one that was super dark, and then with the yellow, the brightness, I just couldn't look away.
Yeah, they're so good looking right now. I went to the bird preserve the other day and kind of sat there. Morgan showed up too. I was sitting there for like 20 or 30 minutes just trying to get a yellow rumped warbler to perch on a like a bulrush. Yeah, super fun. Well, any questions, anyone? Any comments? Or did I answer any conceivable question you could have possibly had? And I just did that great of a job. I doubt it's that.
Can I ask a real detailed ID question, a real finicky ID question?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try my best.
I bird mostly in San Bernardino County, California, actually, although pretty close to where you are. And you always run into the infamous sagebrush versus bell sparrow issue, at least in there at times.
Yeah.
Has there been anything new on field ID of those two species? Because sometimes I have trouble with that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think still the best thing would be the boldness on the level of boldness on the cap and the malar for the bells. It's just going to be a more striking looking bird. And I was out near Corn Creek today, and the sort of the alkaline, I don't know, maybe you don't know it, but it's like a sort of like a alkaline salt flat, very salty, very arid. And I heard a sagebrush sparrow but this should be the time of year where the bells have moved in and the sagebrush have moved out, because they kind of swap depending on the time of year. And I identified it as a sagebrush based off the song, but I was expecting to hear bells. So, you know, yeah, they're tricky birds. Song is great. You can't identify them by call, at least that I know of, like to my ear, I can't. It might be able to be done. But yeah, I think head pattern.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right, well, oh, Lauren.
I wanted to ask you one question. When you're talking about migration, I was just wondering, do all birds do like an out and back where if we see them in the spring, we will also see them in the fall? Or do some of them make more of a loop where we might only see them once a year?
That's a great question. It kind of depends on the species, and even within the species, it depends where in the range they're at. Something like a rufous hummingbird, what they do is kind of a loop, and it has almost everything to do with flower activity. So rufous hummingbirds, they start their wintertime, let's say it's wintertime and they're in Mexico because there are flowers and there's food in Mexico all year round. And there's consistent food. So that's where they're at in the wintertime. It starts to become spring here. Well, the first blooms are going to be in the deserts of the Southwest and actually the Pacific Northwest. And so because these birds are going to Alaska and British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, they kind of go northwest into the Pacific Northwest, as far north as Alaska. And then when it's time for them to migrate as early as July or August, they head down to the Rockies, because in the Rockies in July and August at high elevation, that's when the wildflowers are coming out there. So they go way east to the Rockies, and then from there they go south, and they might go through like New Mexico and Arizona. And so we don't get them as much in the late summer, the fall here. We get more in the spring. But if we do get any, they're going to be way up high, like Mary Jane Falls, late July, you can get rufous hummingbirds because they're in that elevation of the mountains. With other birds, they might do it there and back, but it's very rarely like completely north, completely south. You know, they're adjusting, they're getting moved around in the winds. Every night is different, and they're kind of adjusting and like readjusting and setting a good course. So for some birds, it can be like that. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Mhm. All right. Well, unless there's like a last second question, I'm gonna peace out and enjoy the Earth Day tomorrow. Every day's Earth Day, right? But tomorrow's going to be super fun. So if you get out there to any of the parks, definitely enjoy all the energy out there. I'm going to head out. Thanks everyone for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Mhm. Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.